Thank you. I'm also glad Chris went first, not least because I was late, but also because actually I think setting out all the different definitions is really useful, and actually it's almost as if we planned this because I'm sort of going to pick up from there. So what I want to do is actually just look at the changing nature of the poverty challenge over the last 10 or 20 years, so how the shape of poverty has changed. And then from there, very, very briefly, just think about some of the policy directions that might take us in, and then, more importantly, answering the question that's set today, what does that mean for our data needs? So we'll come on to that at the end. Where have we seen this before? This is obviously this very similar chart to the one that Chris just put up, but the relative poverty and absolute poverty measures since the 1960s. I won't go through it again. Chris has done it. The audience here knows it very well. But I think what's less talked about, and actually Chris touched on this, is that if we take the blue relative poverty line, which was at the heart of the child poverty targets, there's been quite a difference in trends across different family groups. So I've not put pensioners on here, but the sharpest reduction in poverty since the 1990s has been in pensioner poverty. And you also see big declines there in child poverty and parents. Not surprisingly, they're linked. But actually the blue line at the bottom, the working age non-parents, poverty has continued to increase over that period. So this starts to talk to what Chris was saying about the fact that policy was very focused on driving down poverty among certain groups, but actually started to miss what was going on with some other groups, not least the disabled. And of course, if we look at the dots on the right-hand side there, that's these are IFS projections, not mine, but projections for what's going to happen to the poverty rates of each of these groups by the end of the decade. And we see that the progress that's been made over the last 10, 15 years is set to go into reverse. You know, wages are still sluggish, incomes aren't picking up. We know there's more cuts to benefits to come. So all of that combined means that we've had a change in the shape of poverty. So actually working age non-parents form a bigger part than they used to. But also the problem, which has been shrinking to some extent in terms of the absolute numbers of people involved, looks like it's going to start growing again over the next few years. So that raises some challenges. No great surprise in what's been going on with those trends. So for non-parents, the spike we saw in the 80s and 90s due to unemployment, rises in disability. Since the mid-1990s, that trend has sort of flatlined, if you like, and instead what we've seen is just generally poor wage performance among non-parents. For the parents, what we saw again in the 80s and 90s was a growth of worklessness. We saw just a rise in the number of single parents, particularly out of work. But then from the mid-1990s, worklessness started to fall within that group, and I think tax credits in particular, as Chris mentioned, played a major part here in actually encouraging, incentivising people into work and reducing poverty among single parents in particular. But I think what's common to both of those descriptions is that there has been this growth in the importance of in-work poverty. So here our blue line is for those with children who are in poverty, the proportion who are in work has risen from around about 40% in the mid-90s to close to 2/3 today. So much more about people being in work now than it used to be. And even for the group without children, although it's a lower proportion, again, we see an increase in that trend over time. And if we start to drill down into the group of parents, and we look here, so all the proportions here add up to 100%, what's the distribution of working patterns across families with children in poverty? And we see the red line there is couples in work clearly become the predominant position for someone to be in if they are a parent and they're in poverty. And actually, I've not broken it down here because you end up with too many lines, but what's really driving this is single earner couples. So the traditional breadwinner model, if you like, is really driving that shift in composition of poverty within that group. And for the non-parents, it's less marked, and actually, you can't really see it very well, but the line at the top there is workless, is single workless people. So that is still the predominant position for non-parents who are in poverty. But again, the balance has shifted somewhat, so single people in work actually have started to form a larger proportion than they used to. So pay matters, but actually I think dynamics of pay within households also matters, and this starts to take us, I think, into some areas that are statistics and that people in this room can dig a bit more into, that I think some of the interesting trends that we need to look at in the next few years. So this is a bit of work we did a couple of years ago. We are going to update it, not least because we still don't fully understand what's going on with this. This was almost a byproduct of another bit of work we were doing. We were interested in it, and we're going to return to it. But what this chart's showing is, at the start of the period there, we take earnings at the 15th percentile. We actually did this for all percentiles, and they all look quite similar, but the 15th was quite pronounced. And we looked at different people in different family types at that point. So we had women with children, women without children, men with children, men without children. And then we track what's happened to pay growth for those people over the period. And what you see is the blue lines at the top, women have tended to have faster pay growth than the pink lines at the bottom, the men. No great surprise there. We know that from a lower starting point, women have performed better than men. In recent years, the gender pay gap has narrowed, although still significant. But I think what's interesting is that the line at the very top there is mothers, and the second line is non-mothers. So mothers done a little bit better than non-mothers. It's not a great difference there. But more starkly at the bottom, fathers done much less well than non-fathers. So within families, actually the biggest distinction there is between mothers and fathers. So there's something going on within the household. So when we think about the traditional breadwinner model and what that means for poverty, there's something going on here within the households between male and female earnings, which I think we need to understand better. So, what does all that mean? The nature of poverty has changed. What does that mean for policy? That's not for today. I throw these up just to set some context really for what it might mean for data, but some early thoughts. Clearly, we're entering now a period of economic recovery. That recovery needs to be balanced. Actually, the signs are that almost inevitably there will be inequality growing as the economy grows, and so we can expect to see poverty start to increase again in terms of the relative poverty measure. If working poverty is the new thing that we are focused on, then how do we deal with poor wage performance, especially among men? And we can look at labour market institutions, national minimum wage, living wage, unionisation, all those kind of factors. But also employment prospects. So again, if the dynamics within households matter, how do we boost employment within households so that we have not just one person in work, but two people in work, for instance? And so there we need to think about childcare, social care, and there is this issue about disability as well. So disability in terms of household choices, but also in this non-parent group. And actually, I think one of the really big things in the next few years is what all this means for universal credit. We're separately doing a big project. We have an expert panel looking at universal credit. And one of the things that's clear is that universal credit will raise incentives to be in work, but actually for many people it will be very short hours work, so that the optimum point for them to be at in order to maximise the support they'll get from universal credit while still being in work will actually be more like 8 hours than the current sort of 16 hours spike that you get with working tax credits. So what does that mean for poverty? We don't really know yet. We don't know how people will respond to these incentives. But it could be that actually some of the advances we saw with tax credits in the 90s start to go into reverse as people start to reduce hours, even as we bring more people into work. So if those are the policy challenges, then what about data? I've thrown up a few here. There will be more that come up during the day, no doubt. I think first and foremost, let's maintain funding and coverage of the things we've already got. HBAI, I think, is a terrific resource. I'm sure people will have ideas about how it can be improved. But in an age of austerity, in an age of spending cuts, let's make sure we protect that. And I think Chris has touched on this, but I think we need to improve the public understanding of the true experience of poverty. Not least because the nature of poverty has changed over time, and so people don't necessarily recognise what poverty is anymore. And if we want to maintain this as an issue that is at the top of the policy agenda, then clearly we need to connect with the public, and that's up to all of us, I suppose, to draw that out and to dispel myths where they occur. I think the links between low pay and poverty, I've already mentioned. I think it's really key that we understand that better. So within households, what's going on, but just more generally, what kind of jobs are we talking about? Are we looking at people who are persistently in low pay, and that's feeding through into persistent poverty? How do we, if the key is to fix low pay in order to fix poverty, then that's quite a key thing to know, but we need to understand that link between low pay and poverty better, I think. I've not really touched on it yet, but there is this point about differential inflation experiences across the income distribution. Obviously, the Johnson Review highlighted, and we've all done work in this area before, the fact that people at different points of the income distribution experience different levels of inflation. Clearly, this is very key when we think about things like benefit uprating, and I think we need to understand that better. It could be that the differential, we might be at the end of that phase of a differential, with fuel prices falling and food prices not rising the same way that they used to, but we don't know, and we need to understand that better. And I think the issues around the poverty premium are important here as well. There's been a lot of work in that area. It'd be great to see some standardisation of that and some development of that. And my plea, I suppose, is that whatever we do in terms of policy over the next few years, we ensure that we measure its effectiveness properly. So we look at the trends in poverty over the 1990s and 2000s. We say, well, this is clearly tax credits. But actually, it's quite hard to prove a causal link. And it's certainly very hard, if not impossible, to look at the behavioural impact of the introduction of tax credits. So when we think about, and we are thinking about this, how you might reform universal credit in order to boost incentives at the right parts of the distribution for the right people, actually we don't really know how people respond. So people have lambasted the slow rollout of universal credit. I celebrate it. You know, we need to go slowly with that, and we need to. But what we need to be doing is monitoring it as we go, so that we understand quite how people are responding to those effects, and actually just the pure income effects. You know, are we pushing more people into poverty because of monthly payments rather than weekly, because of the other mechanisms involved in universal credit? So that's my list. You will have more, no doubt, but I thought I'd throw that up as a starter. Thank you.